Song of Solomon. The voice of my beloved, look, he comes, leaping upon the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Look, there he stands behind our wall, gazing in at the windows, looking through the lattice. My beloved speaks and says to me, arise, my love, my fair one, and come away, for now the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear upon the earth. The time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in the land. The fig tree puts forth its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. Hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people.
Thanks be to God.
The psalm is taken from Psalm 45, and we will read it responsibly, breaking at the asterisk. My heart is stirring with a noble song. Let me recite what I have fashioned for the King. You are the fairest of men. Your throne, O God, endures forever and ever.
The scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You love righteousness and hate iniquity.
Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you.
With the oil of gladness above your house.
All your garments are fragrant with myrrh, aloes, and cassia.
And the music of strings from 100,000 make you glad.
King's daughters stand among the ladies of the court.
On your right hand is the queen, adorned with gold and gold.
The second reading is from the book of James. Every generous act of giving, with every perfect gift, is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore, rid yourselves of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. But be ye doers of the word, not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and are not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves, and on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look upon the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not bearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. For if any think they are righteous or religious, and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unsustained by this world. Hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people.
Thanks be to God.
Our gradual hymn is number 423 in the blue hymnal.
Thank
Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise
to you, Lord Christ.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I'm going to invite you to sit over here so that I'm not too close to you. Oh, please. When I first graduated from college, and that was quite a number of years ago, and I'm not going to tell you how many. When I first graduated from college, I graduated into the middle of a recession, and I had a hard time finding a job in my field. So since my husband and I, newly married, had very little in the way of reserve income, I went ahead and went back to the retail store that I had worked at when I was in high school. Y'all remember Sears? I went to work in the infant department, which was so much fun because who doesn't love selling all those cute little outfits for newborns? But one of the most important things in that department, at least to management's way of thinking, was the big ticket items. The car seats and cribs and high chairs, the things that people came in and plunked down a good chunk of cash on. And when I had been there for 5 or 6 months, they were feeling very frustrated because those big ticket items weren't selling. They were having sales, and yet no one would buy them. So they called a meeting in the wee hours before the store opened, which I can promise you the whole staff was very excited about. And they sat us all down and they went over their sales program of how to sell the big ticket items. And they emphasized when somebody comes into the store and is looking for something, make sure you approach them within the first minute. Go right up to them and see what it is they're looking for. When they tell you that they're expecting a baby and they're not sure what they need, bring them right over to the car seats and show them the car seats because they're going to need one of those. And definitely tell them about the cribs and our wonderful cribs and make sure that they know that they can order their crib from Sears immediately and sell them as many of those big ticket items as you can because, by the way, new parents are absolutely willing to plunk down lots of money on that stuff. And we don't understand why we're not selling these things. Well, I've always been a little bit of a troublemaker, so I raised my hand. And I said, I can tell you why you're not selling those things. You're not selling those things because we don't have any in stock. I go right up to people and they show me the ad for the car seat, and I go, oh, wonderful, yes, you need one of those. We don't have that one. And then they say, well, what else do you have? And I bring them over to the floor models, and they go, oh, yes, this other one here, this seems like a good one too. I go, yeah, we don't have that one either. And they go, well, what about this third one? I'm like, nope, not in stock. I don't know when we're getting it in. They go, do you have any of them? I go, yes, see this cheap one that failed Consumer Reports? We got 20 of those in stock. It might be affecting our sales. It was not what the management wanted to hear, because as it turns out, ordering stock was the management's job. And they hadn't been doing a very good job of it. So they had instead gone back to what had always worked. Instead of figuring out how to improve things, what really needed doing, they had gone back to the manual and said, if we just reinforce how to sell with our staff, that should take care of the problem. I have ever since referred to it as corporate America solves the wrong problem. I think, in some ways, that's what's going on in our gospel story today. The Pharisees aren't doing anything wrong. I think most of us would really, really like it if everybody here washed their hands before meals. We tell children not to come to the dinner table unless they've washed their hands first. There's nothing wrong with the tradition and the ritual of washing hands. Indeed, what the Pharisees are doing by encouraging this behavior is actually inviting the whole people of Israel to be part of the holy priesthood of God. You see, the priests in the temple all washed their hands and their feet before they ate. They had a lot of traditions and a lot of formal ways of approaching the holy table and of making themselves a holy people. And the Pharisees went, why should that only be a small group of people? Aren't we all part of God's chosen people? Aren't we all part of God's holy priesthood? Shouldn't we all behave and act as though we were children of God? Of course they should. The problem wasn't with what the Pharisees suggested that people do. It was the fact that they were focused on the wrong problem. When the disciples are there standing and eating and in the presence of Jesus, and the Pharisees would come out to see this amazing person who is teaching with authority, who's healing the sick, is raising the dead and feeding the hungry. When they come out to see, instead of focusing on the way the kingdom of God is breaking through in that gathering, they're like, wait a minute, you guys aren't washing your hands. We know what's wrong with this group. You're not following the rules. You're falling short because we have a tradition, and the most important thing for us to do is to follow that tradition. If we follow the tradition, everything else will be okay. And you can hear Jesus' frustration with them, right? I don't think Jesus was trying to tell us that we shouldn't wash our hands before meals, or that we shouldn't have traditions, or that religion was silly. I think Jesus was just looking at them going, you're solving the wrong problem. The problem we're having here is not that there aren't enough people washing their hands. The challenge we're having is that we're not living fully into the promise of God's kingdom. We're not living as though we were all a holy priesthood. We're focused on washing our hands instead of healing the sick and taking care of the poor and making sure that God's kingdom on earth is really present among us. It's not what we take in that matters. It's not the rules that we follow or don't follow that matters. What matters is how that rests in us and what becomes of it. I would like to believe that this was only a problem for first century Jews. But I know better. one of the reasons Martin Luther was so irritated by the book of James, which tells us to be doers of the word, not just hearers of it, is in Martin Luther's time, the church had fallen into the same trap. We had become focused on making sure we did the things, followed the tradition, put our checks next to our checklist. Did I have communion this year? Check. Did I make confession? Check. Have I done what I'm supposed to? Did I show up on Sunday? Check. All right, good to go. Let's move on. And Martin Luther thought, there's got to be more to this than that, because I don't feel like just making the checks is enough to really be the people of God. Well, and so he raised his hand at that meeting, pinned up a bunch of points for management to consider, and we all know how that ended. I'd like to think that once Martin Luther came along, we solved that problem too. But you know, at the start of the pandemic, as we were all desperately trying to figure out how to be church when we couldn't be in the same building, I found myself sucked into a number of conversations about, well, is communion allowable under these circumstances? We had all of these debates over whether or not you had to physically touch the bread or whether you could consecrate the bread through plastic. I actually got very impatient with it. I may or may not have told a parishioner who was hungry and lonely for the Eucharist and who told me that he was watching our service and he was taking out bread and wine and putting on the table in front of him, and he was taking communion that way. I may or may not have said, well, the bishop is very clear that I cannot consecrate the bread and the wine in the church while you're sitting a mile away in your living room. But if Jesus shows up, it's above my pay grade to tell him he's not supposed to be there. Sometimes when we are anxious and worried, when there are things going on, when things are changing especially, and we don't know how to do things, we go right back to that comfortable space of, well, this is what we've always done. Let's follow the tradition of elders. That's the most important thing. If we just focus on the tradition, then everything will be okay and we will get it right. But as Jesus points out, it's so easy for us to be focusing on the wrong things. You know, in these pandemic times when we're not able to be together, instead of worrying about how Jesus is getting into the bread and wine, maybe what we should be doing is figuring out how do we help those who are lonely and isolated and hungry. And never mind worrying about whether it's properly consecrated or whether we can do it with grape juice. Maybe when we are finding ourselves sitting in church alone, not sure how to connect, maybe instead of worrying about how do we get people to come on Sunday morning at 9 a.m., we should be asking ourselves, how can we bring the good news that we're not alone out to the people who are out there lonely? Maybe instead of trying to figure out how do we do Sunday school the way we've always done it, we should be asking, wow, parents have done so much. It has been such a hard 2 years, and it looks like this coming year is going to be just as hard. How do we help them? How do we make this a little easier? Let's go ask them. Maybe it's Sunday school on Sunday morning, or maybe it's something else. Because you know what? What matters is not that we get all those kids in the pew here at 9 a.m. What matters is that we show them the love of God and we help their parents get through this difficult time as things feel like they're falling apart all around them. That's what it means to be doers of the word, not hearers of it. It doesn't mean that we throw away the traditions of the elders. It doesn't mean that we have to stop gathering on Sunday morning to share Eucharist and the sacrament. It just means that we have to be willing to adapt. We have to be willing to know why we do it. And it has nothing to do with getting our little bread and our little wine so that we can go to heaven. And everything to do with being the people of God, living out God's kingdom right here, right now. Sometimes that's going to look the same way it did when my grandparents sat in church, and sometimes it's not. And they're both okay, because it isn't what we do, it isn't the rituals we follow, it isn't the traditions we have, but the way in which we live into God's love for all of us that truly matters. Earlier this week, a Facebook friend of mine, who I have never met and who is, let's see, the friend of the granddaughter of a friend of mine. Does that sound like your Facebook feed too? But she's a young woman in her late 20s, and she shared a blog from someone that obviously resonated with her, who said, "For the last several years, I felt very out of place in the Christian church, which is weird because I love Jesus a lot. I have always believed that church was a place meant for broken people, so I have always shown up honest and messy. It's been uncomfortable, to say the least. Perhaps too often we are too focused on the way we've always done it and fitting people into the spaces that we're comfortable with, instead of welcoming them messy and broken and completely unfamiliar with our traditions. Maybe it's not what goes in that's a problem, but what comes out from us. I hope that my friend's granddaughter's friend will find a church that welcomes her messy, with defiled hands and all. Because that's what Jesus did. And the one thing we need to do more than anything else is to live and welcome the way Jesus did.